I want to eventually get to the question of the center of this conference, which is about the question of trust and reestablishing hope in politics. But before I can do that, we have to, I think, review a little bit about how we got to the present situation and see where the current world situation leads us. You know, it's very important for people who are supporters of liberal democracy around the world to show solidarity with one another. So I greatly admire the work that you're doing in this forum and elsewhere. We've had some big changes that are really challenges to not so much to democracy, but to the liberal part of liberal democracy. First of all, we've seen obviously the rise of authoritarian governments. This is really Russia and China. They represent different kinds of threats. The more troubling challenge to democracy has been the rise of what's called populism or populist nationalism. The question has been discussed a great deal over the last few years about why this appeared in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century. And I think that there's one school that is kind of conventional wisdom that says that this was a result of economic forces, so that, for example, globalization has produced a great deal of wealth, but it's also distributed that wealth relatively badly. Many countries have become much more unequal, and many working class people in relatively developed countries have lost jobs and opportunities to similar workers in China, in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in other developing countries. And I think that's really an explanation for the trigger for this populism in Britain and the United States and other Western democracies that suffered from this kind of economic change. But I don't think it's really an adequate explanation for much of Eastern Europe. There you have to look at cultural issues and indeed this question of trust, because what populist politicians on the right did was to exploit a kind of pervasive distrust of mainstream political parties and the elites that had really governed many countries really since the fall of communism. So unless you get the national identity question right, I think it's going to be hard to restore trust. I want to speak about how the COVID epidemic has affected global politics. We are not going to really understand the full impact of this crisis for years to come. And so I think it's a little bit dangerous to make too many predictions, but we can already see some of the shorter term impacts, and we can speculate about, I think, different scenarios that we can imagine for the future. I think that it's pretty clear that the dominant interpretation of the political impact of COVID is that it's going to strengthen all of the anti-democratic and anti-liberal trends that we already saw with the rise of populism. This is the part where I want to get to something like a more hopeful message. I think it is entirely possible that COVID will also have some good effects that will lead to greater rule of law and greater democracy down the road. This epidemic is a different kind of challenge from many others because I think it's relatively easy to see the relationship between good government, government that is trustworthy, that is competent, that knows what it's doing in handling the epidemic, and good outcomes. And it's relatively easy to see how an incompetent government fails. I think it's these two elements. It's actually effective governance on the part of democratic politicians, and it's sufficient attention to the right kind of national identity that will be critical in restoring trust.